The desert dust rose like ghosts on the horizon as Nora Blackwood stumbled through the barren landscape, her swollen feet dragging through sand that seemed to pull at her like quicksand. 3 days without proper water, her lips cracked and bleeding, the sun mercilessly beating down on her pale skin that had long since burned and now peeled away in painful strips. She was certain she wouldn't see another sunrise. It was 1876, and the promise of a new life in Arizona territory had dissolved like a mirage. The stagecoach robbery 2 days back had left her the sole survivor, the driver and her fellow passengers cut down by bandits who'd taken everything but her life and the clothes on her back. Perhaps death would have been kinder. Her legs finally gave out beneath her, knees striking the hard, packed earth as she crumpled forward. The distant mountains wavered in her vision as black spots danced at the edges. Nora closed her eyes, feeling a strange peace wash over her. At least the suffering would end soon. The ground trembled beneath her palms, a rhythmic pounding growing closer. Perhaps it was death approaching, she thought deliriously. But death didn't come with the sound of hoofbeats or the soft nickering of a horse. Nora forced her eyes open, squinting against the harsh sunlight. A silhouette loomed before her, a man on horseback, his features obscured by the wide brim of his hat. She tried to speak, to beg for help, but her parched throat produced only a raspy whisper. The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the ground. He approached cautiously, and as he drew nearer, Nora could make out weathered skin bronzed by years under the punishing sun, a strong jaw lined with several days' worth of stubble, and eyes the color of a storm-laden sky. He crouched before her, offering a canteen. "Drink," he commanded, his voice deep and rough, like it wasn't used often. Nora's trembling hands couldn't grasp the canteen, and without hesitation he brought it to her lips himself, tipping it slowly to prevent her from gulping too much at once. The water was warm but felt like heaven as it trickled down her throat. After allowing her a few more careful sips, he replaced the cap and surveyed her condition with a critical eye. Without a word, he slid one arm beneath her knees and the other around her back, lifting her as though she weighed nothing. Nora had no strength to protest as he carried her to his horse, a magnificent bay stallion that stood patiently waiting. In one smooth movement, he hoisted her onto the saddle. She swayed dangerously, but his hand steadied her as he swung up behind her. One strong arm encircled her waist, holding her securely against his chest as he gathered the reins with his free hand. "I've got you," he murmured, so quietly she wondered if she'd imagined it. As the horse began to move, Nora surrendered to exhaustion, slumping against the stranger's solid frame. Her last conscious thought before darkness claimed her was that she'd been rescued by a man who hadn't even asked her name. Nora drifted in and out of consciousness, vaguely aware of the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the secure arm around her waist. The sun's position had changed when she next opened her eyes, low in the western sky, painting the desert in hues of amber and gold. The landscape had shifted, 2 rocky outcroppings gave way to scattered juniper trees and patches of scrub grass. "Where?" she managed to croak, her throat still painfully dry despite the water he'd given her. "My place," he answered simply. "Not far now." True to his word, within an hour, a small homestead appeared on the horizon. As they drew closer, Nora could make out a modest cabin of rough-hewn timber, a barn, corral, and what appeared to be the beginnings of a garden plot. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, suggesting someone else might be there. The horse slowed to a walk as they approached, and Nora felt the man's posture change, becoming more alert. "Abram," a woman's voice called out. "That you?" "It's me, Martha," he responded, his voice vibrating against Nora's back. "Found someone out in the flats. She needs help." An older woman emerged from the cabin, wiping her hands on a well-worn apron. Gray streaked her dark hair, which was pulled back in a tight bun, and deep lines etched her face, speaking of years spent in the harsh desert sun. "Lord have mercy," she exclaimed as they drew closer. "The poor thing's half dead." The man Abram dismounted first, then carefully lifted Nora from the saddle. Her legs were useless, and she sagged against him as he carried her toward the cabin. "Get her inside," Martha directed, hurrying ahead to open the door. "I'll heat more water." The interior of the cabin was simple but tidy. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a cooking pot bubbling over the flames. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs sat in the center of the main room, while a curtain partitioned off what Nora presumed was a sleeping area. Abram carried her through to the back of the cabin, where Martha was turning down the covers on a narrow bed. "Put her here," the older woman instructed. "Then make yourself scarce while I get her cleaned up and into some fresh clothes." Abram set Nora gently on the bed. For a moment, their eyes met, and Nora thought she glimpsed concern in his stormy gaze before he nodded curtly and left the room. Martha worked efficiently, helping Nora out of her filthy, torn dress and into a clean nightgown that smelled of sunshine and lye soap. She bathed Nora's face and hands with cool water, clucking sympathetically over the sunburn and scratches. "You poor child," she murmured. "What happened to you, stagecoach?" Nora managed between sips of the broth Martha held to her lips. "Robbers 3 days ago," Martha's expression darkened. "Terrible business. The marshal should hear of this." She smoothed Nora's hair back from her forehead. "But that can wait till morning. You need rest now." Nora wanted to ask about Abram, about where she was and what would happen next, but exhaustion pulled her under once more. The last thing she remembered was Martha tucking the blankets around her, murmuring something that sounded like a prayer. When Nora next awoke, pale dawn light filtered through the cabin's small window. For a moment, panic seized her as she tried to place her surroundings, but then memory returned the rescue, the cabin, Martha's kindness. She tentatively pushed herself to a sitting position, relieved to find her strength somewhat restored. The nightgown she wore was simple but clean, and someone had loosely braided her hair while she slept. "Good morning," came a voice from the doorway. Martha stood there, a steaming mug in her hands. "Thought I heard you stirring. How are you feeling?" "Better," Nora replied, her voice still raspy but no longer painful. "Thank you for your kindness." Martha waved away her thanks and approached the bed, pressing the mug into Nora's hands. "Drink this. It'll help with your strength." The liquid was hot and sweet, tasting of herbs and honey. Nora sipped gratefully. "I'm Martha Wilson," the older woman said, settling on the edge of the bed. "That was my nephew Abram who found you. Abram Calloway. This is his place." "Nora Blackwood," Nora responded. "I was traveling to Tucson. My uncle has a shop there. I was to help him with his books." Martha nodded thoughtfully. "Tucson's still a good distance from here. You're lucky Abram found you when he did." She patted Nora's hand. "He's gone to Copper Creek. That's the nearest town to send word to the marshal about the attack. Should be back by nightfall." Nora felt a strange flutter at the mention of Abram, remembering the security of his arm around her waist as they rode. "He saved my life." "That's Abram," Martha said with a small smile. "Man of few words, but he does what's right." She stood, smoothing her apron. "Think you could manage some real food?" Got flapjacks on the griddle. By midday, Nora had regained enough strength to move around the cabin with Martha's assistance. The older woman provided a simple dress that was too short and wide for Nora's tall, slender frame, but clean and serviceable nonetheless. "Was my sister's," Martha explained. "She passed 3 winters ago, pneumonia." "I'm sorry," Nora said sincerely, "and thank you for lending it to me." Martha shrugged. "No sense it sitting in a trunk. Now, come help me with these beans if you're feeling up to it." Working alongside Martha in the cozy kitchen, Nora learned more about her rescuer. Abram Calloway had come west after the war between the states, seeking solitude and a fresh start. He'd built this homestead with his own hands over the past 8 years, raising cattle on a small scale, and occasionally working as a guide for surveyors and prospectors who needed to navigate the treacherous desert landscape. "Not much for company, my nephew," Martha confided as they shelled beans for the evening meal. Been that way since he came back from the war. Whatever he saw there changed him. Does he live here alone? Nora asked, trying to sound merely conversational. Martha gave her a knowing look. Just him and occasionally me when I come to visit from Copper Creek. I keep house for the doctor there. She paused, studying Nora. He's a good man, though, solid, dependable. Before Nora could formulate a response that wouldn't reveal her interest, the sound of hoofbeats announced a rider approaching. Martha moved to the window. Speak of the devil, she remarked. That's him now. Nora's heart quickened inexplicably as Martha went to the door. She heard the low rumble of Abram's voice, followed by Martha's more animated tones. A moment later, they entered the cabin together. In the clear light of day, Nora could properly see the man who had saved her. Abram Calloway stood well over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered and lean-hipped in the way of men who worked hard for a living. His dark hair, streaked with the occasional strand of silver at the temples, curled slightly where it brushed his collar. The stubble she'd noticed yesterday had been shaved clean, revealing a strong jaw and the faint remnant of a scar that traced from his right ear to his chin. But it was his eyes that captured her attention, gray as thunderclouds and just as turbulent, set beneath straight brows in a face that had seen its share of hardship. They settled on her now, assessing. "Miss Blackwood," he said with a slight nod. "Good to see you on your feet, Mr. Calloway," she replied, suddenly conscious of her borrowed dress and unbound hair. "I owe you my life. Thank you for what you did." A muscle worked in his jaw, and he gave another short nod before turning to Martha. "Spoke to the marshal. He's sending men to investigate the stagecoach attack." His eyes flicked back to Nora. "Said there's been trouble with the Reese gang in that area. Wanted to know if Miss Blackwood could identify any of them." "I'm not sure," Nora admitted. "It happened so fast and they wore bandanas over their faces." But one had a distinctive voice, deep with a slight whistle when he spoke. Abram's expression darkened. "Sounds like Tom Reese. He took a bullet to the throat in a saloon fight few years back. Affects his speech." "Well, that can wait," Martha interjected firmly. The girl's barely back on her feet. "Besides, I need to get back to town myself. Dr. Palmer will be wondering where I've got to." She turned to Nora. "I've packed some of my things for you to use, soap, hairbrush, and such, and the dress is yours to keep." Nora blinked in surprise. "You're leaving?" "Have to, dear. The doctor relies on me." Martha patted her hand reassuringly. "But Abram will see you safely to Tucson once you're strong enough to travel." She shot her nephew a look that brooked no argument. "Won't you, Abram?" He hesitated only briefly. "Of course." "But I couldn't impose," Nora began. "It's no imposition," Abram cut in, his tone making it clear the matter was settled. "It's not safe for a woman to travel alone in these parts." Martha looked between them with satisfaction. "That's settled then. I'll ride back with Abram to fetch my things and he'll return here by nightfall." She turned to Nora. "You rest this afternoon. There's stew on the stove for your supper." Within the hour, Martha had gathered her belongings and embraced Nora warmly. "Don't you worry about a thing. Abram's bark is worse than his bite, and he's a gentleman through and through." As Nora watched them ride away, Martha seated comfortably on a gentle mare beside Abram's stallion. A flutter of apprehension mixed with something else, something she wasn't ready to name, rose in her chest. The prospect of being alone with the taciturn cowboy who had saved her life was both intimidating and strangely thrilling. True to Martha's prediction, Abram returned as dusk was settling over the landscape. Nora had used the afternoon to rest and to make herself as presentable as possible with the limited resources available. She'd washed her face and hands in the basin, combed and braided her long chestnut hair, and smoothed the borrowed dress as best she could. She was stirring the stew when he entered, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door with practiced ease. Their eyes met across the small room, and for a moment neither spoke. "Smells good," he finally said, breaking the silence as he moved to the washbasin in the corner. "Your aunt left it," Nora replied, watching covertly as he rolled up his sleeves and washed the trail dust from his hands and face. The muscles in his forearms flexed with the movement, and she quickly averted her gaze when he turned. "She's a fine cook," he acknowledged. "Better than me, that's certain." It wasn't much, but it was the most he'd said to her at once, and Nora seized the opportunity to establish some rapport. "She told me you built this place yourself. It's very—" She searched for the right word. Solid. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Solid, that's about right." He moved to the cupboard, taking down 2 bowls. Not fancy, but it keeps the weather out. They ate at the small table, the silence broken only by the clink of spoons against bowls and the occasional pop from the fire. Nora found herself studying him when he wasn't looking, the careful, deliberate way he ate, the calluses on his hands speaking of years of hard work, the slight furrow that seemed permanently etched between his brows. "How long have you lived here?" she ventured when the silence grew too heavy. He looked up, seeming almost surprised at the question. 8 years, give or take, alone all that time. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Mostly, Martha visits when she can." Nora nodded, trying another approach. "She mentioned you were in the war." The furrow between his brows deepened. "I was." When he didn't elaborate, Nora sighed internally. Conversing with Abram Calloway was like trying to draw water from stone. She focused on her stew instead, resolving to respect his apparent desire for silence. To her surprise, he spoke again after several minutes. "You said you were headed to Tucson, to work for your uncle?" Nora glanced up, finding his storm-gray eyes fixed on her with unexpected intensity. "Yes. My parents died last winter influenza. Uncle Henry is my only remaining family. He has a mercantile there and offered me a position keeping his books." Abram nodded slowly. "I'm sorry about your parents." The simple statement, delivered in his deep, quiet voice, touched her more than the elaborate condolences she'd received back home. "Thank you," she said softly. "The marshal says the stage line will run again next week," he informed her, rising to take his empty bowl to the wash basin. "We can leave for Tucson then if you're well enough." Nora felt a strange reluctance at the thought of leaving, which was ridiculous. She barely knew this man, and she had responsibilities waiting in Tucson. "That would be fine. Thank you." He nodded once, then moved toward the door, picking up his hat. "I need to check on the stock." "There's a latch on the door. Use it." With that, he was gone, leaving Nora alone with her thoughts and the lingering impression of his storm cloud eyes. The days that followed established a cautious routine. Abram rose before dawn, tending to the animals and working his small herd of cattle before returning for a midday meal. Nora, determined not to be an idle guest, took over the cooking and housekeeping duties, finding satisfaction in the simple tasks that kept her hands busy and her mind from dwelling too much on her ordeal in the desert. They spoke little, but the silences gradually became more comfortable. Occasionally, Abram would volunteer information about the land or the weather, and Nora treasured these small offerings like gifts. In turn, she would tell him about her life back east, her father's position as a school principal, her mother's skill with watercolors, the small Pennsylvania town where she'd grown up. On the 3rd day, she ventured outside, breathing deeply of the clear desert air. The landscape that had nearly killed her now revealed its stark beauty in the morning light, the distant purple mountains, the surprising variety of cacti and desert plants, the vast open sky that seemed to go on forever. She was sitting on a rough-hewn bench beside the cabin, watching a pair of hawks circle lazily overhead when Abram returned from checking his fence line. He dismounted with that same fluid grace she'd first witnessed in the desert, leading his horse to the water trough before approaching her. "How are you feeling?" he asked, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. "Much better," she assured him. "Strong enough to travel soon, I think." Something flickered across his face so quickly she almost missed it before he nodded. "Good." He hesitated, then added, "Thought I might ride into town tomorrow, send a wire to your uncle. Let him know you're safe and will be arriving next week." Nora smiled, touched by his thoughtfulness. That would be wonderful, thank you. He shifted his weight, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain. Thought you might want to come along. Town's not much, but you've been cooped up here for days. The invitation surprised and pleased her. I'd like that very much. The next morning, Nora rose early, eager for the excursion. She washed her face and hands in the basin, braided her hair neatly, and donned the dress Martha had given her. It was still too short and wide, but she'd made adjustments with needle and thread borrowed from a small sewing kit in the cabin. Abram was already outside, saddling the horses his bay stallion and a smaller, dappled mare that he explained had belonged to his sister-in-law. "You can ride, I take it?" he asked, adjusting the stirrups on the mare's saddle. "Since I was a girl," Nora confirmed. Her father had insisted both his daughters learn, believing it an essential skill regardless of gender. Abram nodded approvingly and offered his cupped hands to help her mount. Nora placed her boot in his palms, acutely aware of his strength as he boosted her effortlessly into the saddle. Their eyes met briefly as she settled herself, and something warm fluttered in her chest at the intensity of his gaze. The ride to Copper Creek took just over an hour, following a well-worn trail that wound through stands of juniper and across a shallow creek that gave the town its name. Abram rode slightly ahead, occasionally pointing out landmarks or identifying wildlife, a jackrabbit darting through the brush, a rattlesnake sunning itself on a rock, a coyote watching them warily from a ridge. Nora found herself studying his straight back and broad shoulders, the confident way he sat his horse, the occasional profile glimpse when he turned to speak to her. In these unguarded moments away from the cabin, he seemed more relaxed, more willing to engage. She learned he'd grown up in Virginia, the younger son of a horse breeder. That he'd fought for the Union despite his Southern roots, causing a rift with his family that had never fully healed. That he'd come west afterward seeking space and solitude to make peace with the things he'd seen and done during the war. "And did you?" she asked as they crossed the creek, the horses picking their way carefully through the shallow water. "Make peace with it, I mean." He was silent so long she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was low and thoughtful. "Some days, other days not so much," he glanced back at her. "But this land helps. Something about all this space makes a man's troubles seem smaller." Copper Creek proved to be a modest settlement, one main street lined with essential businesses, a handful of side streets with simple homes, and the inevitable saloon doing brisk business even in the morning hours. People nodded respectfully to Abram as they rode in, several casting curious glances at Nora. Their first stop was the telegraph office, where Abram helped her compose a message to her uncle explaining the robbery, her rescue, and her expected arrival the following week. The operator, a bespectacled man with ink-stained fingers, promised to send it immediately. "Henry Blackwood in Tucson, you say?" he asked as he counted out the words. "Runs the mercantile on Congress Street." "Yes, that's my uncle," Nora confirmed. The man nodded. "Good man. Sends regular orders through here. Always pays his bills prompt." From there, they visited the general store, where Abram insisted on purchasing a few necessities for Nora: a hairbrush, a bar of lavender soap, and a shawl for the cool desert evenings. When she protested, he simply said, "Consider it a loan. You can settle up with your uncle when you reach Tucson." As they exited the store, a woman's voice called out, "Abram Calloway, as I live and breathe. Twice in 1 week the town will start talking." Martha hurried toward them from the direction of a white clapboard building with a small sign identifying it as Dr. Palmer's surgery. Her face broke into a wide smile as she reached them. "And Miss Blackwood, how wonderful to see you up and about." She embraced Nora warmly. "You're looking much better, dear." "Thanks to you and your nephew," Nora replied sincerely. Martha waved away the thanks. "Nonsense. But come, both of you must join me for lunch. Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house sets a fine table, and I won't take no for an answer." Before either could protest, Martha had linked her arm through Nora's and was steering her down the street. leaving Abram to follow with a resigned expression that nevertheless held a hint of amusement. The boarding house dining room was modestly appointed but scrupulously clean, with checkered tablecloths and vases of wildflowers on each table. Mrs. Fletcher, a plump, rosy-cheeked woman in her 50s, greeted Martha like an old friend and showed them to a table by the window. "And who might this lovely young lady be?" she inquired, her curious gaze moving between Nora and Abram. "This is Miss Nora Blackwood," Martha supplied before Abram could speak. "She's staying with Abram until the stage to Tucson runs next week." Mrs. Fletcher's eyebrows rose dramatically. "Is she now? How interesting." She cast a speculative glance at Abram, who met her gaze steadily. Miss Blackwood was the sole survivor of the stagecoach robbery out by Coyote Flats, he explained evenly. "She needed assistance." "Oh, my dear, how dreadful, Mrs. Fletcher exclaimed, her expression instantly shifting to sympathy. "I heard about that terrible business. You poor thing." The meal that followed was unexpectedly pleasant. Mrs. Fletcher served tender roast beef, fresh bread, and a variety of vegetables from her kitchen garden. Martha kept the conversation flowing, sharing town gossip and drawing Nora out about her life back east. Abram said little, but seemed content to listen, his eyes often resting on Nora's face as she spoke. It was during dessert a delicious apple pie that trouble arrived in the form of 3 dusty cowboys, who entered the dining room with the swaggering confidence of men who considered themselves important. "Well, look who it is," the tallest of the 3 drawled, his gaze fixing on Abram. "The hermit of Rattlesnake Ridge, come down to mingle with common folk." Abram's expression didn't change, but Nora noticed his posture stiffen slightly. "Nathan," he acknowledged coolly. "And with a lady no less," the man continued, his eyes raking over Nora with insulting thoroughness. "Ain't she a pretty little thing?" Martha's lips thinned in disapproval. "Nathan Reese, you do well to mind your manners in Mrs. Fletcher's establishment." Nora's heart quickened at the surname. Reese, the same as the gang suspected in the stagecoach robbery. She studied the man more carefully, noting the family resemblance to the second man, who was shorter but had the same sandy hair and narrow face. The third was darker, with a scar bisecting one eyebrow. "Just being neighborly, Ms. Wilson," Nathan replied with a mocking tip of his hat. "Ain't that right, boys?" the shorter man snickered, but his eyes held a mean glint that made Nora's skin crawl. The third merely watched, his expression unreadable. Abram's voice was quiet but carried an unmistakable edge of warning. "Miss Blackwood is traveling to Tucson. She'll be on next week's stage." Nathan's eyes narrowed. "Blackwood, is it? And what brings you to our little corner of the territory, Miss Blackwood?" Before Nora could answer, Abram stood, his movements smooth but conveying a controlled power that seemed to fill the small dining room. "Mrs. Fletcher, the meal was excellent. Martha, we should be heading back soon." Nathan smirked. "Running off so soon, Calloway, and here I thought we might have ourselves a friendly conversation." "Another time, perhaps," Abram replied evenly, though Nora sensed it was the last thing he wanted. Martha rose as well, her expression concerned. "Yes, we should be going. Mrs. Fletcher, please put this on my account." As they moved toward the door, Nathan and his companion stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy, but as Nora passed, Nathan murmured, "Safe travels to Tucson, Miss Blackwood." Roads can be mighty dangerous these days. The implied threat sent a chill down her spine, and she was grateful for Abram's steady presence beside her as they exited the boarding house. "Nathan Reese," Martha explained in a low voice once they were outside, "is Tom Reese's younger brother. The family has a ranch northeast of here, but most folks believe they make their real money through less legal means." "They're trouble," Abram stated flatly, his gaze scanning the street with increased vigilance. "And we should get back before dark." The return journey was more tense than the morning's ride. Abram kept them moving at a steady pace, frequently checking their back trail. Nora found herself watching the surrounding landscape with renewed anxiety, every rustle in the brush a potential threat. You think they might follow us?" She asked as they forded the creek. Abram's expression was grim. "Not likely today. Nathan Reese's more bark than bite when he's sober, but if his brother Tom was involved in that stagecoach robbery." He left the implication hanging. "You think they might connect me to it?" "I didn't see their faces, but I mentioned the whistle in Tom's voice to you, if the marshal knows." "Word travels fast in small towns," Abram acknowledged. "We'll need to be careful until you're safely on that stage to Tucson." They reached the cabin as the sun was setting, painting the desert in spectacular hues of gold and crimson. Despite the tension of the encounter in town, Nora found herself pausing to admire the beauty of it. "It's magnificent," she breathed. Abram, who had dismounted and was helping her down from her horse, followed her gaze to the horizon. "It is," he agreed, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary before he stepped back. "One thing I never tire of out here." Their eyes met, and something shifted in the air between them, a recognition, perhaps, of shared appreciation for this wild, beautiful land. For a heartbeat, Nora thought he might say something more, but then his expression shuddered, and he turned to lead the horses to the barn. "I'll see to them," he said. "You go on inside and bolt the door." That night, as Nora lay in the narrow bed that had been Martha's, listening to the unfamiliar night sounds of the desert, she found her thoughts dwelling not on the threatening Reese brothers, but on the quiet man sleeping just beyond the partition curtain. The man who had saved her life without hesitation, who bought her soap that smelled of lavender because he'd noticed she'd had nothing of her own, who grew tense at the mere suggestion of a threat to her safety. She wondered what Abram Calloway would be like if the shadows of war didn't haunt his eyes, if he smiled more often, if he ever longed for companionship in this isolated place he'd made his home. And she wondered why, with Tucson and her new life just days away, the thought of leaving him behind filled her with a profound, inexplicable sadness. The following days passed in a heightened state of vigilance. Abram continued his necessary work around the homestead, but kept his rifle close at hand, and instructed Nora to stay within sight of the cabin. Each evening, he checked and rechecked the doors and windows before retiring, his concern for her safety evident in every precaution. Despite the underlying tension, or perhaps because of it, they began to talk more. The silences between them grew comfortable rather than strained, and Nora found herself sharing thoughts and feelings she hadn't expressed to anyone since her parents' deaths. In turn, Abram gradually revealed more of himself, careful, measured disclosures that she treasured like rare gems. He told her about his older brother, lost at Gettysburg, about the plantation in Virginia where he'd grown up, now in the hands of distant cousins, about his dreams for this small ranch, the improvements he hoped to make, the cattle herd he was slowly building. "It's a hard life," he acknowledged one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the velvet sky. "Lonely at times. But there's a freedom to it I never found back east." "I can understand that," Nora said softly. "After my parents died, everything felt confining, like the grief had walls that were closing in around me." She wrapped the new shawl he'd bought her more tightly around her shoulders. Coming west was partly about escaping that feeling. He studied her in the fading light, his expression thoughtful. "And has it worked, coming west?" She considered the question seriously. "In some ways, there's so much space here, so much sky, it puts things in perspective." She smiled slightly. "Of course, nearly dying in the desert wasn't part of my plan." The corner of his mouth twitched in what she now recognized as his version of a smile. "Fate has a way of rearranging our plans." "Yes," she agreed, her eyes meeting his in the gathering darkness. "It certainly does." 2 days before the stage was due to run, Abram announced he needed to ride out to check on a section of his herd that grazed in a valley about an hour's ride from the cabin. "I'll be back by midday," he told Nora as he saddled his horse in the pre-dawn light. "Keep the door bolted. The rifle's loaded and on the rack by the fireplace if you need it." She nodded, trying to ignore the flutter of anxiety at the thought of being alone. "I'll be fine," she assured him. "Be careful out there." He hesitated, then reached out to briefly touch her shoulder the first time he'd initiated contact since carrying her into the cabin that first day. "You too." After he rode away, Nora kept herself busy with household tasks, sweeping the cabin's plank floors, kneading dough for the evening's bread, and washing the breakfast dishes. By mid-morning, restlessness drove her outside to tend the small kitchen garden beside the cabin, where she weeded the rows of beans and tomatoes under the brightening sun. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't hear the approaching riders until they were almost upon her. Looking up, her heart froze at the sight of 3 men on horseback: Nathan Reese, his brother, and their scarred companion from town. Nora straightened slowly, acutely aware of her vulnerability and the distance to the cabin door where the rifle waited inside. Nathan's lazy smile did nothing to disguise the malice in his eyes. "Well, if it ain't Miss Blackwood playing house on Calloway's ranch," he drawled. "Where's your protector today, Miss?" Nora lifted her chin, refusing to show fear despite the rapid pounding of her heart. "Mr. Calloway will be back any minute," she lied. "What do you want, Mr. Reese?" The second man, who she now knew must be Tom Reese, laughed, the sound ending in the distinctive whistle she remembered from the stagecoach robbery. "Hear that, Nathan? The lady's got spirit. Mr. Calloway ain't due back for hours yet," Nathan said, dismounting and approaching her with deliberate slowness. "We saw him riding out toward the north pasture, plenty of time for us to get acquainted properly." Nora took a step back, calculating the distance to the cabin. "I have nothing to say to you. Please leave this property immediately." "Now that ain't very hospitable," Nathan replied, his smile hardening. "Especially since we rode all this way just to see you. Word is you're the only survivor of that stagecoach robbery last week. The one where the driver and passengers got themselves killed. A terrible tragedy," Tom added, his whistling speech confirming what she already knew. "Marshall's asking all sorts of questions about it." "I don't know anything about that," Nora said firmly, taking another step toward the cabin. "I never saw the robbers' faces, but you heard them speak, didn't you?" Nathan pressed, moving to cut off her retreat. "And a smart girl like you, I bet you remember all sorts of details." The third man, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. "This is taking too long, Nathan. Calloway could come back. Let's just grab her and go." Fear jolted through Nora like lightning. Without further hesitation, she turned and ran for the cabin, her skirts clutched in her hands. She heard curses behind her and the heavy thud of boots on packed earth as Nathan gave chase. She reached the door just steps ahead of him, yanking it open and lunging inside. But before she could slam it shut, Nathan's weight hit the door, forcing it wide. Nora stumbled backward, frantically scanning the room for the rifle Abram had mentioned. She spotted it on the rack by the fireplace, but Nathan was already between her and the weapon. "That wasn't very polite," he snarled, all pretense of civility gone. "Tom, check outside. Make sure Calloway's not doubling back. Jesse, get in here and help me tie her up." The scarred man Jesse entered, a length of rope in his hands and a leer on his face. "Where'd you want her, boss?" "Cher'll do," Nathan replied, gesturing to one of the wooden chairs at the table. "Then we'll take her somewhere quieter to continue our conversation." Nora backed away until she hit the table, her mind racing. She couldn't let them take her from the cabin if they did. She knew she wouldn't return alive. Her hand groped behind her, seeking a weapon, and closed around the handle of a heavy cast iron skillet that sat on the table where she'd left it after breakfast. As Jesse approached with the rope, Nora swung the skillet with all her strength, connecting solidly with the side of his head. He dropped like a stone, blood immediately welling from the gash at his temple. Nathan's eyes widened in shock, then narrowed in fury. "You'll pay for that, you little wildcat," he growled, advancing on her. Nora brandished the skillet, keeping the table between them. "Stay back," she warned, her voice steadier than she felt. Nathan circled the table, forcing her to retreat. "You think you can take me with a frying pan?" he sneered. I've killed men twice your size with my bare hands. And now you're threatening to kill me too." Nora countered, still backing away. "To add another murder to your conscience after that stagecoach," a flicker of surprise crossed his face before it hardened again. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I? I recognized your brother's voice, that distinctive whistle when he speaks." She was playing a dangerous game, but if she could keep him talking, maybe Abram would return in time. The marshal knows too, it's just a matter of time before he connects the dots. "Nathan," Tom's urgent voice came from outside, "rider coming fast from the east." Hope surged in Nora's chest, but Nathan's expression told her he had no intention of being caught. With a snarl of rage, he lunged across the table, knocking the skillet from her grasp and grabbing her arm in a bruising grip. "You're coming with us," he hissed, dragging her toward the door despite her struggles. "A hostage might come in handy if the marshal does get too close." Nora fought with every ounce of strength she possessed, clawing at his face, kicking at his shins, but Nathan was powerfully built and fueled by desperation. He half dragged, half carried her to the door where Tom waited with the horses, his expression anxious. "Hurry up," Tom urged. "He'll be here any minute," Nathan shoved Nora toward his brother. "Get her on your horse, I'll grab Jessie." But as Tom reached for her, the crack of a rifle shot split the air and the dirt at his feet exploded in a small geyser of dust. "Let her go." Abram's voice was deadly calm as he emerged from behind the barn, rifle aimed steadily at Tom Reese's chest. "Next one won't miss." Time seemed to freeze as the tableau held Tom with his hands still outstretched toward Nora, Nathan in the doorway, and Abram advancing with the rifle unwavering in his grip. "This ain't your fight, Calloway," Nathan said, his tone conversational despite the tension thrumming in the air. "The girl saw something she shouldn't have. We're just going to have a talk with her." "She's under my protection," Abram replied, his voice still eerily calm though his eyes blazed with controlled fury. "And you're trespassing on my land." Tom's hands began to twitch toward the pistol at his hip, but Abram's sharp "don't" froze him in place. "You're outnumbered, Calloway," Nathan pointed out. "Jessie is inside and there's two of us out here." "Jessie is not going anywhere with that head wound," Abram replied, his gaze flicking briefly to Nora. "And I like those odds just fine." What happened next unfolded in a blur of movement and sound. Tom made his play for his gun, and Abram's rifle cracked again, the bullet striking Tom's shoulder and spinning him backward. Nathan, seizing the distraction, drew his own weapon, but Nora, acting on pure instinct, threw herself against his arm as he fired. The bullet went wild, and Nathan cursed, shoving her roughly aside. Abram was already moving, closing the distance between them with long strides. He slammed the rifle butt into Nathan's wrist, sending the pistol flying, then followed with a devastating punch that dropped the outlaw to his knees. Tom, clutching his bleeding shoulder, scrambled toward his horse, but Abram's voice stopped him cold. "Take one more step, and I'll put the next bullet through your spine." Within minutes, Abram had both Reese brothers tied securely to the corral fence post. Jessie, still unconscious, was dragged from the cabin and bound alongside them. Only then did Abram turn to Nora, his eyes scanning her for injuries. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, though her arm throbbed where Nathan had gripped it, and the reality of what had just happened was beginning to sink in, making her tremble. "No, I'm all right." Abram's expression softened minutely. "You did good in there, quick thinking with the skillet." Despite everything, a small, shaky laugh escaped her. "My mother always said a good cast iron pan was a woman's best friend in the kitchen. She never mentioned its uses in self-defense." The corner of Abram's mouth twitched in that almost smile. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." He glanced at the bound men, his expression hardening again. "I need to ride to town, bring the marshal back here. Will you be all right for a couple of hours?" Nora straightened her shoulders. "I'll be fine. They're not going anywhere." She paused, then added softly, "Thank you, Abram, for coming back when you did." Something flickered in his eyes, an emotion too complex to name, before he nodded once. "I'll always come back for you, Nora." The simple declaration, spoken in his deep, steady voice, resonated in her chest like a promise. And as she watched him ride away, the rifle she now held competently in her hands trained on the sullen prisoners, Nora Blackwood realized with startling clarity that she had fallen in love with the taciturn cowboy who had saved her life not once, but twice. The marshal arrived with Abram just before sunset, accompanied by 2 deputies. Nathan and Tom Reese, along with their accomplice Jesse, were loaded into a prison wagon for transport back to Copper Creek, where they would await trial for the stagecoach robbery and murders. "You'll need to come to town tomorrow to give your statement, Miss Blackwood," the marshal informed her, a grizzled man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Your testimony about recognizing Tom's voice could be crucial." "Of course," Nora agreed, standing on the porch beside Abram as they watched the wagon depart. "I'll tell you everything I can remember. She'll be there," Abram confirmed, his stance protective beside her. When they were alone again, the full weight of the day's events seemed to descend on Nora all at once. Her knees buckled slightly, and Abram's strong arm was immediately around her waist, steadying her. "Let's get you inside," he said, concern evident in his voice. "You need to rest." The cabin, which had been the site of such violence earlier, now felt oddly welcoming as Abram guided her to a chair and poured her a small measure of whiskey from a bottle he retrieved from a high cupboard. "Drink," he instructed, just as he had that first day in the desert. "It'll help with the shock." Nora sipped obediently, the liquor burning a fiery path down her throat and spreading warmth through her limbs. Abram busied himself lighting the lamps and building up the fire that had died down during the commotion. There was something profoundly comforting about watching his methodical movements, the careful competence with which he approached even these simple tasks. "The stage leaves for Tucson the day after tomorrow," he said after a while, his back to her as he stoked the fire. "Yes," Nora replied, a curious hollowness forming in her chest at the reminder. Abram straightened, still facing the fire. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice measured. "It might be best if you stayed in town tomorrow night after giving your statement. Martha would put you up, I'm sure. Then you'd be right there for the early stage." Logical, practical, and yet the suggestion felt like a stone dropping into the pit of her stomach. "I suppose that would be sensible," she agreed, striving to keep her voice even. He turned to face her then, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. Unless," she echoed when he didn't continue. Abram ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of uncertainty from this usually composed man. "Unless you've reconsidered going to Tucson at all." Nora's heart began to beat faster. "What do you mean?" He moved to sit across from her at the table, his storm-gray eyes intent on her face. "I mean that these past days, having you here, it's changed things, changed me." He paused, seeming to search for words that didn't come easily to him. "I know we've only known each other a short time. I know you have plans, a job waiting with your uncle, but I think we could build something good here, together." Nora's breath caught in her throat. "Abram, are you asking me to stay?" "I'm asking you to marry me," he said simply. "It's not much I can offer: a small cabin, a hard life in a rough country, but I'd protect you with my life. I'd work every day to make you happy, and I think we could be good together, Nora." Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision. "Why?" she whispered. "Why me? Why now?" Abram reached across the table, his calloused hand covering hers. "Because when I found you in that desert, something woke up inside me that I thought had died in the war. Because every morning I've woken up knowing you were under my roof, and it's made this place feel like a home for the first time. Because the thought of watching you get on that stage and never seeing you again." He shook his head. "I can't do it, not without at least asking." Nora turned her hand beneath his, lacing their fingers together. "I've never been so scared as I was today," she admitted. "Not even during the stagecoach robbery, but when you came riding back when I heard your voice." She squeezed his hand. "I knew I was safe." I knew everything would be all right. Is that a yes? He asked, hope and uncertainty warring in his expression. It's a yes, she confirmed, a smile breaking through her tears. Yes, I'll marry you, Abram Calloway. Yes, I'll stay and build a life with you here. The transformation of his face in that moment was something Nora knew she would remember until her dying day. The perpetual furrow between his brows smoothed, the tension around his mouth released, and his eyes, those storm cloud eyes, lit with a joy that took her breath away. He rose from his chair, pulling her gently to her feet and into his arms. One hand cupped her face with exquisite tenderness, his thumb brushing away a tear from her cheek. I'm not good with words, he murmured, never have been. But I promise you this, I will spend every day showing you that you made the right choice. I already know I have, Nora whispered, and then his lips were on hers, warm and sure, sealing their promise with a kiss that felt like coming home. The wedding was a simple affair, held in Copper Creek's small church, 2 weeks later. Martha, overjoyed at the news, had thrown herself into preparations with boundless enthusiasm, ensuring that Nora had a proper dress, ordered from Tucson and altered to fit, and that the church was decorated with wildflowers gathered from the desert. Nora's Uncle Henry had been initially concerned by her change of plans, but his letter in response to her telegram had been warm and supportive. Your happiness is what matters most, he'd written. And if this man has won your heart so completely in such a short time, he must be extraordinary indeed. He'd even made the journey from Tucson to give her away, arriving the day before the ceremony with a wagon loaded with wedding gifts, practical items for their home, books for the long winter evenings, and a beautiful quilt that had belonged to Nora's mother. The whole town turned out for the occasion, curious to see the woman who had captured the heart of the reclusive Abram Calloway. The marshal and his wife served as witnesses, and Dr. Palmer himself played the fiddle for the celebration that followed at Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house. Throughout it all, Abram rarely left Nora's side, his hand finding hers at every opportunity, his eyes following her with a warmth that belied his usual reserved demeanor. When they danced awkwardly at first, then with growing confidence, the tenderness in his expression made her heart swell with happiness. Are you having second thoughts yet? He murmured as they swayed together to a slow melody, the celebration winding down around them. Nora smiled up at him, her hand resting on the solid breadth of his shoulder. Not a single one, you. Only that I didn't find you sooner, he replied, brushing a soft kiss against her temple. We should head home soon, it's a long ride, home. The word filled her with a profound sense of rightness. The cabin that had been just Abram's was now theirs, and they had spent the days leading up to the wedding making small changes to accommodate their shared life, a larger bed that Abram had crafted himself, curtains for the windows that Nora had sewn from fabric Martha provided, a second rocking chair for the porch where they could watch the sunset together. The ride back to the ranch that night was different from any before. They traveled side by side under a canopy of stars, the horses picking their way along the familiar trail, the night air cool against their skin. Occasionally their eyes would meet in the darkness, and a current of anticipation would pass between them, a shared awareness of what awaited at journey's end. When the cabin came into view, Abram reined in his horse and Nora did the same, puzzled. What is it? He dismounted and came to her, reaching up to lift her from the saddle. But instead of setting her on her feet, he cradled her in his arms. My grandmother would turn in her grave if I didn't carry my bride across the threshold, he explained, a smile in his voice. Nora laughed softly, winding her arms around his neck. Far be it from me to upset your grandmother. He carried her to the cabin door, which he'd left unlatched before they departed that morning, and pushed it open with his foot. Inside, the embers of the morning's fire still glowed faintly in the hearth, casting a warm, dim light throughout the room. Abram set her gently on her feet but kept his arms around her. In the shadowy light, his face was serious again, his eyes intent on hers. I want you to be happy here, Nora. If there's ever anything you need, anything that would make this place more of a home for you, she silenced him with a finger against his lips. All I need is you, she said simply. Everything else we'll figure out together. The tension in his shoulders eased and he caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. Together, he agreed. That night, in the new bed he had built with his own hands, Abram Calloway showed his bride just how deeply he loved her. His calloused hands surprisingly gentle as they explored her body, his lips reverent against her skin. And when they came together as husband and wife, the last barriers between them falling away, Nora knew with absolute certainty that the path that had led her through hardship and danger to this man's arms had been the right one all along. 5 years later, the sound of childish laughter echoed across the yard as Nora watched from the porch, smiling at the sight of Abram on all fours in the dirt. Their 3-year-old son James perched triumphantly on his back. The boy's dark hair, so like his father's, fell across his forehead as he bounced excitedly, small hands clutching Abram's shirt. "Faster, Papa, faster," James demanded, and Abram obliged with an exaggerated neigh that sent the child into peals of delight. Beside Nora on the porch swing, 6-month-old Sarah slept peacefully, one tiny fist curled against her cheek. The baby was fair like Nora, with a dusting of chestnut hair and eyes that were already showing hints of her mother's deep brown. "Don't wear your father out completely," Nora called to her son. "He still has chores to finish before supper." Abram looked up at her, a grin transforming his face in that way that still made her heart skip. 5 years of marriage had softened the furrow between his brows and brought smiles more readily to his lips, though he remained a man of few words around others. With his family, however, he had found his voice reading stories to James each night, singing lullabies to Sarah in a deep, gentle baritone, whispering words of love to Nora in the darkness of their bedroom. "Are you suggesting I can't keep up with a 3-year-old, Mrs. Calloway?" He called back, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "I'm suggesting that if supper gets cold waiting for you two, you'll have only yourselves to blame," she replied, trying to sound stern but failing as James let out another whoop of joy when Abram resumed his crawling. Life on the homestead had changed dramatically in 5 years. The cabin had been expanded first with a proper bedroom for James when he was born, then with a larger kitchen and living area as the family grew. The cattle herd had increased threefold, allowing them to hire 2 hands to help with the work. A small orchard now grew where once there had been only scrub brush, and the kitchen garden had expanded to provide vegetables nearly year-round. Copper Creek had grown as well, with a proper school now operating where James would attend in another year or 2. Martha still lived in town, working for Dr. Palmer, but visited often, doting on her great-nephew and niece with unabashed adoration. The Reese brothers and their accomplice had been convicted of the stagecoach robbery and murders, their testimony at trial revealing a string of similar crimes stretching back years. Nathan and Tom were serving life sentences at Yuma Territorial Prison, while Jesse had hanged for his role in the killings. Uncle Henry visited from Tucson twice a year, always bringing books and educational toys for the children and the latest news from the growing city. He had offered Abram a partnership in a cattle buying venture that had proved profitable for both men, allowing the Calloways to make the improvements to their homestead without financial strain. But the greatest change, Nora reflected as she watched her husband and son play in the yard, was in Abram himself. The shadows that had haunted his eyes when they first met had receded, replaced by a contentment that deepened with each passing year. He still had occasional nightmares about the war, still fell into periods of quietude when memories pressed too close, but those times grew rarer as their life together flourished. "Mama, look," James called, drawing her attention back to the present. He had managed to stand on Abram's back, wobbling precariously as his father remained perfectly still beneath him. "I see you, my brave boy," she called back. "Be careful now." James beamed at her approval, then promptly lost his balance, tumbling into the dirt with a surprised oof. Before Nora could move, Abram had scooped the boy up, checking him for injuries before tickling his ribs mercilessly, turning potential tears into shrieks of laughter. Sarah stirred at the noise, tiny face scrunching before her eyes blinked open. Nora gathered the baby into her arms, smoothing the wispy hair from her forehead. "Did your brother wake you, sweet girl? He's just playing with Papa." As if on cue, Abram approached the porch, James riding on his shoulders now, small hands buried in his father's dark hair. "Someone mentioned supper," Abram inquired, his eyes warm as they moved from Nora to the bundle in her arms. "And how's my little lady?" "Just waking up," Nora replied, shifting so he could see Sarah's face. The baby cooed at the sight of her father, arms waving excitedly. Abram reached out to stroke a gentle finger down his daughter's cheek. "She looks more like you every day," he observed. "Beautiful, just like her mama." Even after 5 years of marriage, his compliments still brought color to Nora's cheeks. "Flatterer," she accused fondly. "Now get yourself and that dusty boy washed up. Supper really is getting cold." Later, after the children were asleep, and the night had wrapped itself around their home like a blanket, Nora and Abram sat together on the porch, a quilt draped across their laps against the autumn chill. His arm was around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest, the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear, a sound that never failed to comfort her. "I had a letter from the marshal today," Abram said, breaking the companionable silence. "He's retiring end of the year. Moving to San Francisco to be near his daughter. He's earned his rest," Nora replied. "Who will take his place?" "That's what he wrote about, actually." Abram's voice held a note of uncertainty that made Nora lift her head to look at him. "He's recommended me for the position." Surprise widened her eyes. "You, as marshal," he nodded, his expression serious. "Said he needs someone honest, someone who knows the territory and the people, someone who can't be bought or intimidated." He paused. "It would mean moving to town." Nora considered this, her mind racing with the implications. "What about the ranch? We'd keep it," he assured her. "Hire a foreman to run it day to day, build a proper house in town near the school for James." His hand found hers beneath the quilt. "But I won't accept it if you're not completely certain. Our life here, it's good. I wouldn't change it unless you wanted to." Nora squeezed his hand, touched as always by his consideration of her wishes. "What do you want, Abram? Would being marshal make you happy?" He was silent for a long moment, considering. I think I could do some good in that position, help keep the peace, make the territory safer for families like ours." He looked down at her, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "But my happiness isn't tied to a job or a place. It's here with you and the children. That won't change whether we're on this ranch or in town." Warmth bloomed in Nora's chest at his words. "Then I think you should accept," she said decisively. "The children would benefit from being closer to school, and I admit I wouldn't mind having neighbors a bit nearer." She smiled up at him. "Besides, I think you'd make a fine marshal. You certainly have practice at rescuing damsels in distress." A low chuckle rumbled through his chest. "Just the one damsel," he corrected, pulling her closer. "And as I recall, she did a fair job of rescuing herself, armed with nothing but a cast-iron skillet." "We make a good team," Nora agreed, snuggling into his embrace. "We always have." Abram pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "From the moment I found you in that desert," he murmured. "Though I never imagined then where that road would lead us." Nora thought back to that day 5 years ago, how close she had come to death, how a stranger's kindness had not only saved her life, but changed its course entirely. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Stopping for me that day," Abram tilted her chin up, his eyes serious in the moonlight. "Nora Calloway, finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me. Every day since has been a gift. I never thought I'd have a family, a purpose, a woman who loves me despite all my flaws." "Not despite," she corrected, reaching up to trace the strong line of his jaw. "I love all of you, Abram, the quiet and the storm, the gentleness and the strength, every part." He caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm, just as he had on their wedding night. "And I love all of you, always will." As their lips met in a tender kiss, the desert night enfolding them in its vast, star-spangled embrace, Nora reflected on the journey that had brought them here from a chance encounter in the wilderness to this rich, full life they'd built together. A journey that had begun when she was too tired to keep moving, until a cowboy lifted her onto his horse without a word. Sometimes, she thought as Abram's arms tightened around her, the end of one road was just the beginning of a far better one, a road meant to be traveled together.